Good morning. Today is Thursday, October 31st. I'm Reverend Dr. Elise Cannon, Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. I can't believe today is day 391 since October 7th of last year. For those of you who joined last week, and I don't remember who asked, but someone asked for a congressional update. And so I thought I would start this week. Kyle Christophalo, our head of DC office, asked if or someone last week asked if I would give a congressional update, and Kyle Christophalo, our head of DC office, did a bit of a summary. And so I thought that I would start with that. So from Washington, DC, just yesterday, Politico reported that members of Congress have taken hundreds of AIPAC-funded trips to Israel over the past decade. The bottom line of the article was that tons of money has been spent by the nonprofit arm of the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC. Their goal is to shape U.S. lawmakers' perspectives, particularly now of Israel's the most conservative government in Israel's history, to shape our lawmakers' perspectives of that government. Politico said that there were 5 months after October 7th where members of Congress were not going to Israel. But then after those 5 months, 8 trips have happened. 71 members of the House and staffers have traveled from March through September of 2024. There have been more Republicans than Democrats. And so I wanted to give you an update in that regard. Critics, it's interesting how divided the House and the Senate are. Not interesting, but one of the comments of the article was that critics like Bernie Sanders have called for the halt to arms in the face of the offensive on Lebanon and what's been happening in Gaza. And then you have senators like Lindsey Graham, who's a Republican from South Carolina, who have demanded more funding for Israel to help Israel beef up its defenses. So the article asserts that members are taking lessons from these trips to Israel from AIPAC, and that these travels have significantly shaped their views. More than 25% of all of the trips from members of Congress have been trips to Israel. And in the past, since 2012, there have been more than 4,100 trips funded by Israel, or trips that have been to Israel, according to a study by the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. So all of that's from that article in Politico. The updates from Kyle in terms of what's going on in Congress, there have been quite a few letters. I talked about one of these letters in a daily update this past week. Senator Bernie Sanders, Peter Welch from Vermont, and Republican Becca Balint, Representative Becca Balint, a Democrat from Vermont, and 9 other members of Congress wrote to the Biden administration demanding that the U.S. open up an investigation about an Israeli attack that happened in South Lebanon in October of 2023. This included an American journalist, and he's actually from Vermont. His name is Dylan Collins. And if people are interested, I can tell you all of the members who signed that letter, but the letter from Sanders explicitly was referring to this Israeli airstrike. Several journalists were wounded, and one was killed. Dylan Collins was injured. This was October 13th, 2023. Collins was a part of this broader group of journalists who were international. This was highly controversial because the journalists were very clearly marked. They had press vests on. And the group had communicated their position to the Israeli military. They'd been filming for close to an hour. They were struck twice by Israeli tank rounds and machine gun fire. One of the journalists, I think, had a leg amputated. Another journalist from Reuters was actually killed. Congressman McGovern also recently sent a letter regarding press access into Gaza. He is a Democrat from Massachusetts. A ranking member of the House Rules Committee and co-chair of the Human Rights Committee. He's led 64 of his colleagues in a letter to President Biden and Blinken, calling for the U.S. to push Israel to allow for unimpeded access for journalists into Gaza. And the letter talks about the constantly shifting dynamics in Gaza and how it is absolutely necessary that journalists be allowed to be able to have access. So you might wonder why this is important. Earlier this year, we had a meeting with the White House. It was a member of the National Security Staff. And this person at the White House said that The Biden administration could not respond to certain allegations related to limitations about humanitarian access and assistance because journalists are not allowed to enter the enclave. And the point that was being made by the Biden administration was that they don't know what's happening there is because there's not independent journalists who are present inside of Gaza. Journalists have gone into Gaza, but they've only gone in when they are accompanied by the Israeli Defense Forces, which is not considered independent journalism. And I'll let you make your own assessments about that. But I wanted to be sure to let you know about that letter, sponsored by McGovern. Congress is in recess. They will be so until after Veterans Day, which is November 12th. The most urgent matter, other than the presidential election, of course, but the most urgent matter on Capitol Hill, at least, is there are 6 joint resolutions of disapproval which have been introduced by Senator Sanders. They each deal with different arms sales. They were each introduced individually. Joint resolutions of disapproval are privileged in the Senate. But there is a guarantee there will be a vote at some point after Congress returns from recess. We don't think they have a firm date at the moment for when that will be, but we expect it will be taken up fairly soon after they return. Also, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, Democrat from New York, recently promised Jewish leaders that he would later this year try to pass a bill aimed at curbing anti-Semitism on college campuses. Students have returned to college campuses. We've not heard a lot about protests the way that we did in the spring, at least not to the same degree. The bill for Schumer would be Congress's most forceful response to the pro-Palestinian protests that happened in the spring, which sometimes led to the harassment of Jewish students. Critics argue the definition of anti-Semitism that the legislation offers is overly broad. There's been a lot of conversation about the conflation of anti-Semitism and criticism of anti-Zionism. Sources familiar with the discussion say that they remain skeptical that Schumer will get the bill through the Senate this year. So that's an update on Congress. I'll now shift to some highlights. Highlights is the wrong word, but to some summaries of what's happened in the news in terms of the Middle East this past week. And, when I was putting this together, what just kept coming to mind is, and I'm not trying to be melodramatic in any way, shape, or form, was just, when I do these daily updates, it's just death, death, and death, ongoing trauma, ongoing violence, more people killed. Let me tell you about this situation. Another school is bombed, another dozen people here. And, one of the reasons I think it's so important to do this daily and to hear these stories is so that we don't become immune to it. And so I'm going to summarize some of the incidents of death and violence that happened this past week in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Israel, in the occupied West Bank. On Tuesday, the 29th of October, there was an Israeli strike on a residential building in Gaza. Originally, the reports said 60 people were killed. Reports later indicated 93 people were killed. It's indicated that over 24 children were in that building. This was the deadliest strike since Israel has intensified its offensive in the north of Gaza. On that same day, Tuesday, a 22-year-old resident in northern Israel, there's a city there called Ma'alot Tirshia. The resident is Mohammed Yasser Naim. The name would indicate an Arab Israeli, perhaps Palestinian, was killed in a Hezbollah rocket strike that hit the city. The deputy commander of Hezbollah's elite Radwan force, Mustafa Ahmad Shahadi, was killed in an airstrike in South Lebanon. On Tuesday night, going into Wednesday, Israeli strikes in the Bekaa Valley overnight killed 67 people and wounded 120 people. We'll talk more about the Bekaa Valley and the significance of those strikes in a minute. The Guardian in the UK reported on the 27th of October, Israeli strikes in Gaza killed approximately 70 people, with Israeli offensives in the north showing no signs of abating, even in the midst of renewed ceasefire talks. On the 27th, an Israeli strike in South Lebanon killed 8 people and wounded 25. I had intended to come with a summary of the death toll in Lebanon. I know that it's more than 2,000 people, but I did not pull that number. As of October 29th, the death toll in Gaza, and this was significant, this week, the death toll in Gaza surpassed 43,000 people. So as of the 29th, it was at least 43,061 Palestinians killed, and those injured more than 101,223 injured. I wanted to spend a few minutes. A significant thing that happened this week was laws passed by the Israeli Knesset related to UNRWA, the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians. There were 2 bills set to ban UNRWA, the UN agency related to Palestinian refugees. As of yet, there's no alternative body. The reports that I read from months ago was that the UN was distributing much more than 40% of aid. It might be a much higher number than that. I did not verify that statistic, but I know it's a huge amount of aid. Prior to October of last year, the number of refugees in Gaza was the vast majority of residents were refugees. The move is set to take place in 90 days. If you'd like further explanation of why the Knesset was so in favor and their reasoning, I have some bullet points I can return to when we have a few minutes for question and answer. But that passing of legislation essentially will make it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for UNRWA to continue its operations. The ban does not apply to operations specifically in Gaza, but it makes it illegal for UNRWA to operate in Israel, and all of the permits for Israel have to go through, all the permits for Gaza for UNRWA have to go through Israel. I'm sorry if my words got muddled there. Haaretz reported related to Gaza, and they were quoting Reuters that about 100,000 people were marooned in North Gaza, specifically in Jabalia, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun, without medical or food supplies. Reuters could not verify the number independently. The UN warned that there could be an extreme famine in North Gaza, and that entire population could die of starvation. On the 27th, the Israeli military said it had captured 100 suspected militants during a Friday raid on one of the last functioning hospitals in North Gaza. I'll just remind people that the 2 churches, the Latin Family Catholic Church and the St. Porphyrius Church, are in North Gaza, and there continue to be hundreds of people taking shelter in those church communities there. In the West Bank on the 26th of October, it was said that 29-year-old a Palestinian man was killed by Israeli military in Tulkarem. The Israeli military said that the man, Aslam Odeh, was a Hamas operative, that he was planning to carry out an attack. They said that he had weapons in his vehicle. Hezbollah named Naim Qassem, a longtime deputy leader, as its new secretary general. The person who was initially named as second in command was also killed sometime this month. But Naim Qassem has replaced Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed in Israeli airstrikes last month. While Qassem said nothing works for them in terms of a possible truce agreement, there have been conversations about a peace agreement between Israel and Hezbollah. He articulated that Israel is not satisfied, that Hezbollah is not satisfied. There's a potential ceasefire agreement that would be 60 days, according to Reuters. And then the idea would be a 2-month period that could be used to allow for time to implement the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. We've talked about that before. 1701 was the resolution that was passed at the end of the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. And what it demands is the demilitarization of Hezbollah. It would give control of the South Lebanese border to the Lebanese army. And it demands that Israel withdraw from Lebanon and back into Israel. So that's the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Those are the terms of that 60-day ceasefire that's being proposed between Israel and Hezbollah. But as of yet, there's no agreement. In Israel, there is so much division, and there has been quite a bit of evidence about this past week. 1,000 figures from the literary industry, including noted authors, have signed a pledge to boycott Israeli cultural institutions that are complicit, this is a direct quote, and silent observers of the overwhelming oppression of Palestinians. These are Israeli citizens, maybe living in Israel or outside of Israel, who denounce Israeli genocidal apartheid regime. That's also a direct quote. From Jerusalem, yesterday or in the last couple of days, BBC published an article that talked about how there is an Israeli ex-security advisor. He was an advisor for 4 different prime ministers. His name, Aron Etzion. And this article was published. He served in the IDF. He was an ex-security advisor. He has advised Israeli Defense Forces soldiers, particularly in North Gaza, that they should defy orders that might be war crimes. This is unheard of for someone to go public in Israel about this, for an ex-security advisor to say something like this. He said that Israeli Defense Forces might be committing war crimes in North Gaza, and he suggested that officers and troops should reject illegal orders. I mean, that if you said that in the military, I mean, that's treason. That's treason. So this is a sign of the discord within Israeli society. This past week, another 2,000 Israelis signed a letter published in 11 languages. Listen to this. Asking the international community to use every possible sanction to, quote, save us from ourselves, end quote. Israeli citizens in Israel and abroad call on the world to intervene immediately and implement every possible sanction to achieve an immediate ceasefire between Israel and its neighbors for the future of both peoples in Israel and Palestine and the people of our region, and for the rights to security and life. Many describe themselves as veteran activists of, to end the occupation. Motivated by our love for the land and its residents, we're concerned for their future. The specific actions the letter talks about are true international pressure, ending arms supplies, ending economic and security partnerships, scientific and cultural collaborations, withholding international support in order to pressure Israel to agreeing to a ceasefire. And just a couple miles from Gaza, on the other side of these 2,000 Israelis calling for every possible sanction, you have the pro-settlement group and top Israeli politicians gathered and declaimed their grand visions for the future of Gaza. Ben-Gvir, one of the senior ministers of the Israeli coalition, if we want it, we can renew settlements in Gaza, he said, and he said he would encourage voluntary transfer of Palestinians living in war-stricken Gaza out of the territory, and he would invite and encourage the return of Jewish settlement. In a separate gathering during Samach Torah, a celebration in Sderot. Sderot was one of the cities, I've spent time there, that was attacked on October 7th a year ago. This last Thursday evening, the finance minister Smotrich said with God's help in a year, they would be celebrating the festival in Gush Katif, a settlement block in Gaza that Israel had disengaged in 2005. The international community's response, South Africa's legal team submitted and delivered its main legal case accusing Israel of genocide against Palestinians in the International Court of Justice. You will recall they were the ones that first brought forward the case about genocide many, many months ago. In terms of Iran, I maybe should have started with this, forgive me, because last weekend, the most significant news was that Israel attacked Iran. They would say it was a counterattack. They fired a barrage of precise strikes on military targets in Iran on Saturday. This missile attack was targeted. They launched it from Iraqi airspace. Initially, I'd heard that and was, I was surprised, but they launched it from Iraqi airspace. They hit air defense systems around energy sites. 4 Iranian troops were killed. They hit weapon production sites. According to Israeli sources, they crippled critical components of the ballistic missile program. Now, the Iranian sources denied that their missile sites were crippled in any way, shape, or form. So there was a debate on how significant the strikes, minimized capabilities. Reports indicated that the strikes were specifically done that way so that Iran could talk about how they were not, that destructive. That authorities on both sides adopted measured tones in response to the strikes, that there were that was a part of the strategy, if you will. The US and the world said, okay, this should be the end of the, back and forth, that this should be the end of the direct exchange of fire. The US ambassador to the UN said that as well, and warned that if Iran sought to counterattack again, there would be severe consequences. The US very much supported Israel in that regard. I wanted to just close and then leave a few minutes if there are questions. CIA Director Bill Burns has floated a 28-day ceasefire hostage swap proposal at a meeting this past week with Israeli and Qatari envoys. Netanyahu said that he was willing to accept a different proposal that had been proposed by Egypt. Israel's working to advance a framework that would secure the release of a very small number of hostages, 8 or so, in exchange for a 1-month ceasefire. The idea was if you could get even, just less than 10 hostages released, maybe you could then build off of that. The Egypt proposal was announced on October 27th. The idea was like a 2-day ceasefire, just a couple of days, 4 hostages would be released, a bit of aid would be allowed into Gaza. which, by the way, I met with the Jordanian ambassador to the US yesterday, and she said all of this talk, if you recall, the US said 30 days for Israel to allow more aid into North Gaza. And she said there might be 50 trucks a day. She said there's been no significant improvement. But this Egypt proposal would be just 2 days. And so there's these proposals on the table, but there's been no significant movement. Everyone has said that there will be continued hostilities until the US presidential elections. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and 7 foreign counterparts warned Netanyahu and the actions of his far-right minister that they may cause an implosion in the Palestinian economy and risk further destabilization with the actions that they're taking. Now, this was a huge concern when I met with Ambassador Liu, the US ambassador to Israel, when I was there in May. He's an economist. He had said the imploding, the Palestinian economy's destabilization is one of the greatest security threats to Israel. The US Pentagon and Department of Defense has said that the US is running low on some critical air defense missiles as the crisis in the Middle East has widened. And just days away from the presidential election, GOP nominee Donald Trump offered Israel his backing in wars with Hamas and Hezbollah. Even as his campaign has sought Arab American votes, he said, do what you have to do, in a call that he had with Netanyahu earlier this month. And finally, I told the story earlier this week about the Palestinian from Gaza, 19-year-old Shaban al-Dalou. He was the young man who was burned to death, living in a tent next to the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza. His father had rescued his brother and sister and had cried out to his son that he was sorry he could not save him. And then a few days later, his younger brother, 10, and his teenage sister, his brother's name was Abdul, his sister's name was Farah. They also succumbed to death because of their burns, which I wanted to be sure to let you know about as well. So another devastating week in the Middle East, which is critical that we not ignore. So that is the update. I'll close there in terms of my daily report. Many blessings to you. Please pray for us. Many of us leave for the Middle East. We have a delegation that'll be on a trip. And then we have the End Still We Rise Summit is coming up in mid-November in Jericho. It's not too late if anyone wants to come. We're flying through Amman. All of our flights were canceled and we all had to reschedule them. And so there's a lot of logistics. So please pray for certainly an end to all the hostilities, but pray also for us specifically if you would. We would greatly appreciate it. So may God go before us. Many blessings to each of you. Amen.